Hello and good evening to those of you joining us in Asia. Good morning to those of you joining us in Europe, and hello to everybody watching this on demand. My name is Matt Tudball, Senior Editor for Recycling ICIS, and I'm very excited to be taking part in ICIS's first ever virtual PET Value Chain Conference. So I'm going to be joined today by Helen McGeough, Senior Analyst for Recycling here at ICIS, and also leader of our Global Analytics team for recycling. And we're both going to be taking a look at the impact that coronavirus has had on both recycled PET markets, but also on recycling and sustainability as a whole. So I'm going to kick off today by looking at the impact on the prices of our PET and how this has been comparing with virgin. And Helen's going to round up by looking at areas such as collection and sorting rates and legislation and how the coronavirus and the drop in oil prices have impacted all these as well. So there are many factors that affect the rPET market over the last 18 months, and all of these elements from consumer pressure, innovations in packaging and recycling, and unexpected events like the coronavirus have all gone to have a direct impact or an indirect impact on the recycled market. I think though of particular interest and what I'm going to dive into is what's been happening with the crude oil drop and how that's then directly or indirectly affected the rPET pricing. So until the last couple of years, or until sustainability targets really started to have an impact on recycled materials, recyclates were pretty much at the mercy of their virgin counterparts and those virgin counterparts' upstream markets. So looking on this graph, you can see here the prices from the PET value chain. So we've got here paraxylene, PTA and MEG. And excusing any production issues or supply constraints or supply disruptions even, the majority of the time, the upstream markets have tracked the price of crude oil. So when the crude oil prices dropped considerably in April 2020, it made sense that the virgin markets would follow suit. Coronavirus has turned the traditional seasonal demand patterns for both PET and rPET on their heads. PET actually was one of the few markets that saw increases in demand as a result of the outbreak, with bulk buying of food and water alongside hygiene products such as hand sanitizer, and these are often packaged in PET bottles, for example. However, we have seen that brands like Coca-Cola, Nestle and Danone, they've all reported year-on-year losses in sales volumes in Q1 2020 as a result of the pandemic. So while there was some early PET demand which surfaced around March time and into April, partly due to packaging demand, but also linked to reduced collection and sorting activities in parts of Europe, limiting that post-consumer bottle supply, the falling virgin prices dragged down by crude meant more and more converters were substituting away from the already higher priced recycled PET back to virgin PET as that price gap grew ever wider. This was particularly evident in the sheet market, where sources in the rPET market in Europe said some converters had switched back to almost 100% virgin, or probably even 100% virgin in some cases, in the months after the outbreak of the coronavirus. So the graph on the screen that you can see here shows the traditional seasonality of rPET colourless flake prices, and this is made by taking the average price per year and then showing where flake prices trended above or below that average over the last 14 years. And you can see 2020 prices started on an uptick as increased demand for recycled content kept prices high. But since April and throughout May, and in fact throughout the rest of the year, more and more converters have moved back to virgin, as I've mentioned, leaving flake producers desperately trying to compete with lower PET prices whilst maintaining some kind of margin. Aviation data from our sister company Cirium shows a massive drop in the number of flights taken into and around Europe, showing how coronavirus has completely changed travel patterns and tourism patterns throughout this year. Despite the earlier strong demand related to bulk buying, demand for food packaging from the on-the-go market, so this is things like ready meals, packed vegetables, sandwich stuff that you would buy if you go into the office, if you were working, you go out for lunch, grab something on the go. And in particular, actually, smaller water and beverage bottles has dropped dramatically as people have stayed at home during the lockdowns across Europe. So there is a wide-held fear that the PET industry has almost experienced its peak summertime demand in the form of that panic buying that we saw earlier in this year, and that the rest of 2020 will be conducted in some kind of survival mode. And this is probably fair to say the recycle markets too, actually, but players in the rPET market are already predicting only small upward movements in the virgin PET prices, which means unless there is a downwards movement in rPET feedstock, post-consumer bottles, and subsequently then into the flake market, rPET flake and pellet producers are going to be competing for market share with virgin for the foreseeable future. It's also worth stating here, though, that it's a lot easier to get information or confirmation on substitution in the flake markets than it is in the food-grade pellet markets. So these two graphs really emphasise the split away from virgin PET prices that we are seeing in both the rPET flake and food-grade pellet markets. Across all three recycled polymer markets, so that's recycled PET, but also recycled polyolefins like polypropylene and polyethylene, the drops in virgin prices have really impacted demand for recycled material, particularly the likes of rPET flake, where converters had switched back to lower priced, higher quality material, as I previously mentioned. It's worth noting at this point, actually, that the flake market has found itself in a particularly tricky position this year. As while flake prices have had to drop to try and compete with that lower virgin price, the post-consumer bottles are dealing with, well, they haven't dropped necessarily as much. So the flake producers are competing with the low virgin, but are also not able to see the drop in the post-consumer bottle prices that normally accompanies such a drop with flake. So their feedstock costs haven't necessarily dropped as much as they need to in order to allow the flake producers to be competitive with virgin. And if you add on to this the fact that demand from sectors such as automotive and non-packaging markets, which are often key markets for things like recycled polypropylene, rPET fibre and strapping, it's showing limited signs of recovery at present, then it could be some time until we see recycled materials become competitive with virgin again. However, there are still some encouraging signs in the market from the sustainability goals, which Helen will go into more detail on later on. The fact that food-grade pellet prices have maintained almost 100% premium, I think at the moment we're around 93% premium above virgin, during the course of the pandemic, indicates that there is still support for recycled material, particularly in Europe. This very much highlights the disconnect with virgin PET prices and the fact that, certainly for food-grade pellets, rPET food-grade pellets, it's now become its own market, pretty much separated from the virgin PET market altogether. A lot of brands and FMCGs would have locked down their supply of food-grade material at the beginning of the year, though there are some signs that contracts are being reevaluated. There's been some smaller offtakes of volumes we've heard, certainly in August, but there remains some limited spot activity in the market, maybe as people are trying to offload material. But those prices, the majority of prices that we're hearing, are still falling within the range that we've seen for 2020, and this is also likely to go into 2021. At least I spoke with a food grade pellet seller last month, and they've said they're not seeing a massive difference between 2020 and 2021 prices when they're in discussions with their customers. And as Helen will go into, brands know that despite the lower virgin costs, if they don't support their suppliers, they will be the ones that are going to lose out at the end if they emerge on the other side of the coronavirus, whatever that looks like, with less food-grade pellet suppliers to choose from, and that really will turn it into a seller's market. It's a similar picture when we look at the US market, a market actually which ICIS is currently looking at and expanding its coverage in. More on that in a moment. Taking the ICIS quotes for food-grade pellets from both the East Coast and the West Coast and comparing them then to virgin PET bottle grade, you can see how the pellet prices, which are represented here by the dark green and light grey horizontal lines, have moved away from the virgin PET, which is represented by the light blue line, since March 2020. So the red and blue vertical bars show the spreads between pellets and virgin for both the East Coast and the West Coast, East being blue and West being red. So as I mentioned, we are looking to expand our coverage on the US rPET market. So if there's anybody watching or in the audience that would like to discuss this with myself or my colleague Mark Victory, please do get in touch. My email address is at the end of this presentation, or you can find me through the ICIS events networking tool. So I'm now going to hand on to Helen, who's going to look at the long term as well as touch on collection and sorting and also the impact on legislation.
So looking at some of the market drivers behind sustainability, there's been a lot of pressure from regulators and consumers. Clearly, front page news was the plastics pollution issue, which saw a backlash from consumers, partly going to the anti-plastic position, but many more looking for action and action for change. So one aspect we saw was the EU respond with the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which came through Parliament in record time. This has pushed the collection rate specifically for PET and plastic bottles in general to 90% by 2029, and for the first time mandated the use of recycled content in bottles. So this has really created much more demand for recycled PET in particular. Supermarkets likewise felt that pressure from consumers that they wanted more a greater focus on packaging and excess packaging, and they've also looked for increasing the use of recycled content in their packaging. Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been very active. The global commitment has seen global major brands and FMCG companies signing up to that commitment, increasing the recyclability of their packaging, pledging to use recycled content. And those pledges have gone way beyond the mandate, and we're now seeing an average of 50% recycled content commitments in the bottle market by 2030. So from this survey that we conducted, ICIS conducted in the industry on recycled PET in Western Europe in 2018, we found that collection was growing. The collection growth rate was around 3% per annum. To reach the 2025 target under the Single-Use Plastics Directive, that growth rate would need to be 9% per annum. So we are some way off of achieving that. There is a lot of restriction in investment in collection and sorting, which is primarily the responsibility of governments and the municipalities. Funds are going elsewhere. Waste management doesn't always hit the top of that list in terms of priorities. And so collection, really, the systems aren't really growing much at all. And this is why we're seeing a lot of discussion about deposit return schemes as one means of achieving those higher rates, because we look at the top 7 collection rates in the region. They're all in countries that operate a deposit return scheme. So there's a lot of argument towards that, because it not only increases the volume, but it also improves the quality significantly. So we know a number of countries are discussing that. They're kind of leapfrogging the decision that might be made later on if they're not getting near the targets, and really putting it higher on the agenda today. But they won't necessarily impact the 2025 target, but may have some positive impact on the 2030 targets. Likewise, the survey was looking at how much recycled PET is being used in different applications. Looking at the food grade area specifically, we found over 300,000 tonnes of food grade recycled PET supply in the market, fully utilised in 2018. Looking at the targets again, as set by the Single-Use Plastics Directive, we would need to see that usage triple for the 2025 goal. And looking at the longer term higher goals, that growth rate would need to be 26% per annum. Now, clearly, if supply is being fully utilised now, there needs to be a lot of investment. But this links into the collection issue. If collection's not growing, and in particular the quality is not improving, then that's going to restrict the availability of high quality feedstocks, and therefore is going to probably mute investment by some, because you're not going to build a line if you cannot get that high quality feedstock to feed that line. That said, we do know a lot of projects are coming on stream. 2020 has been caused a delay to that for obvious reasons, and we fully expect that that a lot of those projects will come back on stream in 2021. Another trend we see is converters actually broaching this in a different way. So preform producers have been installing extrusion technology so that they can purchase flake and use that to actually then put direct into their line, so that they can offer a preform with recycled content. So supply is improving, but as you can see, the growth rates need to be quite ambitious. This situation is not exclusive to Europe. If we look at the US market, we can see the PET bottle collection rate has remained pretty static, around 30% for a number of years now. There is no federal legislation in the US that really mandates or requires recovery rates to reach a certain level. So this is really industry-led in terms of creating some demand for the material downstream, but it's simply not enough to drive that considerable change that's needed to see those collection rates elevate. So what we see is that comparing the two markets in terms of the PET bottle collection rates, the US just under 30% and Europe more than double that. And whilst Europe may appear to be and is performing better in many regards, it still shows there is a long way to go, and much improvement to be made. But the collection issues, whilst there may be different drivers behind them, the issue is still there in terms of improving recovery throughout the supply chain. Another aspect to look at is, where is the demand for recycled PET coming from in terms of end markets? We've talked about the regulation and the interest from the bottle segment, but if we actually look at where recycled PET is being used today in both the US and European markets, what we can see, a very similar story in that there are mixed markets, a very mixed set of markets demanding the material, and it's not simply going bottle to bottle, as many perceive that it does. So in the US, we have a huge demand from fibre, particularly the BCF market and carpet fibre-related markets. There is a good chunk going into packaging applications as well. In Europe, it's much more biased towards packaging, with nearly 3/4 of the supply going primarily to packaging only. We can see a bigger share goes to the sheet market, but as Matt touched upon, there will be some shift in that demand going towards the bottle segment. So I expect that green segment to very much grow for 2019 and 2020. But the point here is as well is that there's obviously a lot of demand coming from the bottle segment on its own, but it's having to compete with other markets, and is doing so quite strongly at this point in time. And there is a lot of challenge for other end markets, because ultimately all these markets are trying to source recycled PET from one single source, that is the bottle stream. And so we could see potentially the supply being very, very constrained going into other applications other than bottle and packaging. That said, we can see that there has been a lot of financial stimulus in the industry. Clearly, a lot of packages have had to come into place to address the whole COVID-19 situation and supporting the population and industry and economies. But that's not taking away the focus from green investment. We obviously have the EU Green Deal. The new president of the EU is very much behind this, very committed to getting this progressed. So that's a very positive indication that we have. And that feeds into other initiatives such as the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. We've seen the IMF talk about paying tribute to the coronavirus victims in making a better future and looking at how we can improve the way we live. And I think that feeds into consumer sentiment as well. The focus on sustainability and sort of the great global climate crisis may have faded a little whilst we've been going through the pandemic, but it's our expectation this will return fully in 2021. And we see other initiatives such as the Green Recovery Alliance, where politicians and brands and FMCGs and global companies have signed up side by side to say that they want to see investment have green shoots. That the investment really should be, the opportunity is here now for the investment to be headed in that direction, and that's what they would like to see. So there are positive indications that this focus will return, and while any sort of short-term impact on sustainability in 2020, we can expect a resurge in 2021. So we can see there has been a short-term reaction to low virgin prices, and it has a ripple effect through the chain, immediately in the viability of some of the businesses being able to stay in business, and therefore, the potential that some supply may possibly be lost during this year and longer term. But of course, that affects the financial viability of some of those businesses, and therefore restricts their available cash flow to indeed invest in the future as well. All of this potentially will lead to reduced supply, and so competition for the supply will increase because demand has not diminished overall, and so prices will be sustained, if not rise even further. But all of this is still in a supply constrained environment, and therefore we can expect that there will be a lot of pressure on achieving those targets in the longer term. We do anticipate, as I've just touched upon, about the focus from consumers and legislators alike that, we need to make changes and contribute to the plastics pollution issue, to the greater climate crisis. And if the plastics industry and the packaging industry doesn't take action, there could be much more backlash from consumers and legislators alike, and in various forms. So we think there will be that pressure growing, striving for that circular economy, and we do see a much greater focus on reducing carbon footprint from industry, and a better understanding within the consumer base as well of this issue. So there are lots of factors that need to be addressed. There are a lot of factors that consumers are becoming increasingly aware of, and the industry is acutely aware of that as well. So there are lots of possibilities and options and opportunities, but I guess the main concern really here is that there is going to be a lot of short-term or knee-jerk reaction to the low virgin prices that could have some longer-term ramifications. So the focus on sustainability, the commitment is key, but equally, the players need to understand their decisions today can have long-term ramifications, and so commitment should not really wane. Thank you for your time.